about the obstacles to sustainability and how we should combine sustainability with a higher quality of living. If I could have my second slide, please. It shows, in a sense, how miserable we all are. This is a picture taken outside Oxford Street Tube Station in central London. These are people in the prime of life going to work. Every face there looks anxious, depressed, unhappy. There's not a smiling or happy face amongst them. And that, for me, is a reminder of how inefficient our way of life is at producing well-being. What I'm going to try and do in this short lecture is, if we could go to my third slide, outline what went into a pamphlet that I and Kate Pickett wrote, published by the Fabian Society. It's called A Convenient Truth, because I think that one of the really important changes which allows us perhaps to approach sustainability more easily than might have been possible in the past is that our societies have largely got to the end of the real benefits of economic growth. If you look at the next slide, it shows life expectancy against CO2 emissions. Very similar to the shape if you put life expectancy against gross national income, gross national product per capita. What you see there is rapid rises in life expectancy in the early stages of economic development, and then it levels out. So all the rich countries, as they get still richer, are producing more and more carbon, but not getting any further improvements in life expectancy. That's not because life expectancy has ceased to improve. It's still improving as fast as ever, but it's no longer related to economic growth. That curve is really important because it's very similar if we look at other measures of well-being, not just life expectancy, but for instance happiness and so on. The rapid improvements early on in economic growth, and then it levels out. Really what that is, I suppose, is a curve of diminishing returns to rises in income. Diminishing returns in terms of the real issues to do with the quality of our lives. Basically that in poorer countries it's important for people to have higher material standards because many of them haven't got basic necessities. But in the rich world, having more and more of everything makes less and less difference. The convenient truth is that just as material standards cease to be the crucial determinants of further improvements in well-being, we now recognize from research on health and happiness that the quality of social relations has become absolutely crucial. If you look at, for instance, studies of health and the quality of social relations, you find, for instance, that whether or not people have friends is more important to survival over a follow-up period than whether or not people smoke. That is the conclusion of a meta-analysis of 150 studies of friendship and health, but also the quality of your relationship with your partner, whether you're involved in community life, all contribute to health. And a very similar picture coming out of work on happiness. It's basically a matter of how we are related to each other, involved with each other. That's what now matters. So as we become aware of the limits to growth and the environmental damage, we see actually that we've got to the end of the benefits of growth, and that the way now we can improve the real quality of our lives is by improving the quality of the social environment. And I'm going to show you that crucial in that is levels of inequality. I want just to remind you of the things that went into our spirit level book, where we looked at the effect of different amounts of income inequality in different developed countries, and a whole range of outcomes. So if I can move to slide 5, here you have a list of the major outcomes we looked at in different countries: life expectancy, children's maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide, imprisonment, teenage birth rates, how much people feel they can trust others, obesity, mental illness, and some figures on drug and alcohol addiction. And lastly, social mobility, how much people are sort of free to move up and down the social ladder in a society. And we put all those together in one index in our spirit level book, and it turns out that it's very closely related to the scale of income differences in a society. We were looking simply at how much richer is the top 20% than the bottom 20% in each country. So on the bottom axis here, you see the more unequal countries on the right, USA, Portugal, UK, and the more equal ones on the left, Norway, Sweden, Japan. The more unequal countries are doing worse in terms of all these measures that I just mentioned listed on the left there. They're all weighted equally, but interestingly, if we move down, if we go to the next slide, you find just the same thing. If you look at UNICEF's in child well-being, that's the index that came out in 2000 or just after 2000. It contains about 40 different measures of child well-being closely related to inequality. UNICEF have just produced another index of child well-being in rich countries, and we find that too is similarly related to inequality. Worse outcomes, children doing less well in more unequal societies. But if you look at those same measures in relation to, as you see on the next slide, slide 8, that index of health and social problems, combining all those major problems in rich countries, you see it's not related to gross national income per head. The same is true on slide 9 with the UNICEF index of child well-being. So although we talk a lot about child poverty as the problem, we must distinguish between relative and absolute poverty. The real problem is where children are in the relation to the rest of us, and how unequal the societies they're growing up in are. I think that and it's not only that we have more of all these kinds of problems in more unequal societies, and each of those is related independently to inequality. Both we find in the American states, more unequal states do less well, and internationally, the same picture. But there is another very major effect of inequality as it affects our standard of living, and that is, or quality of life. And that is that if you're in a very unequal society where some people are so important and other people appear so unimportant, we all become more worried about where we are in society, how we are seen and judged by others. It looks as if in more unequal societies we judge each other more by status. There's evidence, for instance, that there's more status anxiety in more unequal countries, and both men and women choosing partners put financial prospects, give it a higher priority in more unequal countries. And so, as you see on the next slide, slide 10, I think this leads to more worries altogether about how we're seen and judged. What psychologists call the social evaluative threat increases. in a way so that you only feel really relaxed when you're at home alone, because the rest of the time you've got to be putting on worrying about self-presentation, making an effort to give a good impression. Particularly now we live in societies which have lost a sense of community, and we're endlessly having to meet new people each day. And I think this ups the, if you like, all the kinds of self-doubt, social anxieties that plague particularly young people's lives. I mean, so you can't go out to a party or a club or whatever without endless worries, particularly girls, about how they look and what people are going to think of them. Men worrying about status and money and whether they've got the right clothes and the right sort of smartphone and all the rest of it. And so you need a few drinks before you go to allay some of these anxieties and fears. And of course, one of the major uses of drugs at social events is drugs that make you feel at one with other people. And all these sorts of anxieties are regarded, I think most people see them as a sort of private anxiety, a private failing, if you like, and not seeing that some kinds of societies up the stakes, increase and intensify all these worries about how we're seen and judged. And I think that is another very major effect that inequality has on the quality of life. A key element, if we could move to the next slide, 11, a key element in the relationship between and sustainability is that inequality intensifies consumerism. We can see that in many different ways, that, for instance, in more unequal societies, people work longer hours, they get into debt more, they save less of their money, basically because money becomes more important, is how you show what you're worth. And related to that last slide where I was talking about the social evaluative threat, there has just been a paper from people at the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States showing that people in more unequal parts of the United States are more likely to buy high-status cars. That kind of consumerism, triggered by the increased worries about social comparisons, social judgments of where you are, if you like, what some people call the Veblen effect, to do with conspicuous consumption. So if we want to reduce consumerism, and consumerism really is one of the main threats to sustainability, we have to reduce inequality, because so much of consumerism is about that status competition. There are interesting other links between inequality and sustainability. In the next slide, you see one of the questions from a survey, an international survey of business leaders' opinions. And one of the questions business leaders were asked from different countries is how important they thought that complying and having strong environmental international agreements on environmental limits and so on was. And in more equal countries, on the left there, you find that business leaders think that the environmental issues are much more important, whereas in the more unequal countries on the right, they give them less priority. And I think the sense perhaps amongst business leaders in the more unequal countries is that we just have to fend for ourselves. On the next slide, you also see that recycling more of our waste materials. We recycle more of our wastes in more unequal countries. These last two, I think, graphs showing the beneficial effects in terms of sustainability of greater equality come from the fact that community life is stronger in more equal societies. One of the most fundamental effects of inequality is that as we all become more worried about how we're seen and judged, there is a withdrawal from community life. Social contact perhaps comes to seem more like an ordeal, and there are many research papers that show people trust each other less, community life is weaker, we're less involved in, with people around us. And I think that means that in more unequal societies there is less sense of the common good, we're more out for ourselves. And of course, recycling and issues to do with sustainability depends on an awareness of the common good like never before. So the question then is how we reduce income differences, and I think this is a really important issue. And of course we have to do it partly by dealing with the tax havens, and OECD has started to make agreements with some of the tax havens on sharing information on accounts with tax authorities in different countries. And we have to deal with tax avoidance or different forms of that. But I think more fundamental and a better way of dealing with inequality is to expand economic democracy. Many European countries, unfortunately not Britain, have legislation requiring employee representation on company boards. It's weak in some countries and much stronger in others. But companies with employee representatives on the board tend to have smaller income differences within them. And countries that have that strong legislation of that kind, I think, have had smaller rises in inequality. I think one of the key ways we can move towards sustainability for this and a number of reasons involves expanding economic democracy, not only those systems of employee representation, but also growing the sector of our economy that is made up of mutuals, cooperatives, employee-owned companies, things like that. They have many different benefits. You find, for instance, that they seem to be nicer places to work in the various surveys that assess companies or give awards to companies for being good employers. Cooperatives and employee-owned companies obviously do well. I think they do better in environmental terms. They also, as many evaluations now show, all more democratic forms of company organization seem to, the more democratic forms seem to have higher productivity. There are actually economic advantages in economic democracy. People have also said that an employee buyout of a company turns a company from being a piece of property into a community. The main reason why our income differences have widened so dramatically over the last 30 years or so is the takeoff of top incomes. There's a paper showing in the 350 biggest American companies that the pay differences between CEOs and the average production worker was something like 30 or 40 to 1 until the early 1980s. And then the differential took off, and it's now 10 times as big. By the first decade in the 21st century, the differentials were, in the biggest companies, were more like 300 or 400 to 1. And so, in a way, that's the problem we have to look at. And again, it points to the need, it's a reflection of the lack of any democratic constraints on the people at the top. And of course we have to deal with that by building in the democratic constraints. And that's another reason, of course, why I'm in favour of greater economic democracy. But if we move to the next slide, you see the overall pattern of inequality over the 20th century, from here 1920s through to the end of the century. You see that inequality was high until around 1930, and then it declined. It declined continuously until sometime in the late 1970s, and then from 1980 onwards you get the modern rise of inequality. And that is very substantially, if you like, the waxing and waning of the strength of the labour movement, the strength of unions, the strength of social democratic parties, as a countervailing voice in society. You can see that very clearly if you look at, take as a measure of the strength of that countervailing voice, trade union membership. If we can skip on to slide 16, you see there the findings of a study looking at inequality in relation to the proportion of the population or the labour force in trade unions in 16 OECD countries. Each dot there is a country at a particular point of time, and on the right you see countries which have a high proportion of the population in trade unions, with lower inequality, and on the left, weak trade unions with higher levels of inequality in those societies. If you look at the next slide, 17, you see these trends over time, in this case within the United States, but these graphs, like this one, exist now for many different countries. The red line at the top is the trends in income differences during the 20th century, which we looked at a moment ago, and the blue line, which is almost the inverse of the red one, is the proportion of the labour force in trade unions. So what has really driven changes in income inequality is, as Paul Krugman has said, politics. And as soon as the left, if you like, the progressive forces, the social democratic parties lost any idea of really where they were going, neoliberalism took over. We get a huge rise of inequality, driving up consumerism, making us less attentive to the common good, and having all these other effects on, as I showed you earlier, levels of violence and teenage births and so on in our societies. So I think that really we can move towards a higher quality of life in more sustainable societies, where we no longer have these levels of social evaluative threat, no longer quite so worried about how we're seen and judged, where there's stronger community life, where health and well-being develop further because of the improvements in the social environment. But I think that also we should be able to improve leisure. If you're no longer trying to spend every penny, and perhaps more than every penny you possess, on consumption, then maybe we can use improvements in productivity to increase leisure, the time for friends and family and community. And on my last slide, 18, you see a summary of that. You know, we have reached the end of the real benefits of economic growth. Greater equality is an important way of improving the real quality of our lives. But we do have to make people aware that sustainability is not just an unwelcome belt-tightening exercise, but is really consistent with and necessary for improving the real quality of life, particularly in terms of the social environment and our confidence in relation to each other, ability to enjoy each other's company. But that must be done by extending democracy into the economic sphere, because I think that transforms the experience of work, and the quality of social relations at work, and it should allow us to increase leisure rather than endlessly higher levels of income and so on. So that is, I think, the view we must try and develop of what is entailed in sustainability. So instead of seeing it as an unwelcome belt-tightening exercise, we see it as part of how we next improve the real quality of life. The big obstacle, of course, is big corporations, and I think these huge incomes at the top mean that the interests of CEOs are often now opposed to the real interests of their companies. They will fight extensions of economic democracy, but big corporations, they fought the research on the evidence of global warming, of the importance of dealing with pesticides, drug safety issues. They run rings around national governments, lowering corporation tax, not paying even the taxes that are meant to be implemented. They pack out all the committees on standards to try and ensure safety of medicines and so on. I think the time has come where we really have to grasp that nettle of how to deal with the big corporations. That is a necessary development in order to break that pact, which is about, that I started off with, about maximizing consumption and profits and so on, and big businesses' interests in sustaining these insecurities, these status insecurities, that means that our favourite activity is shopping, although endless research shows that people are most into consumerism, materialism, who spend more than they can afford. It's not a sign of well-being. It's a sign of status anxieties, insecurities. It goes actually with low levels of well-being. So let us paint a picture of a better society in the future, and this road of how to get there, which I've tried to outline in that Fabian pamphlet, A Convenient Truth. So thank you.